All right, so today's session will be on social network analysis, situated and unsituated networks, which I will describe what that is. And my colleague Srebrenka, as I mentioned, is here to present alongside me. So in terms of what we're hoping to get out of today, as I mentioned, I'll start with just a basic overview of what social network analysis is. I will tell you how we conceptualized situated versus unsituated networks and how we collected that data. And then I will hand over to Srebrenka to provide some example networks and data visualizations that we have from the SOCITS project. And then, of course, we'll end with a Q&A. So just for those of you who are not familiar with social network analysis, there's not one definition of what social network analysis is. Rather, it's a field or a way of looking at data and relationships. So since we're talking about social network analysis and not just network analysis, I would say that social network analysis is the study of relationships within some sort of social space. So my research tends to focus on friendship networks amongst young people. But as I'll show over the next couple of slides, there's all sorts of different ways that we can look at networks. But basically, it's some sort of like social ecosystem where there are different entities that are all connected via some sort of relationship. So, for example, a very stereotypical sort of network would be participants in a course. So at time one, you have people come to a course and you ask who knows whom in the classroom. And then at the end of the course, you take another social network snapshot and you see now who knows each other. So you can see that at time two, there are much more many more relations and the network is more densely connected. There's also a famous study out of the US, one of the first studies that I looked at in my social network trajectory. So looking at romantic or sexual relationships at a US high school. And this is just mapped out here. You can also look at collaboration amongst a team. So in this case, academics, where the nodes are colored by the department that they are part of. So you can see clusters of like this red department over here or this green department, blue department, and kind of see how people collaborate with each other. You can also have animal networks. So this is a social network of dolphins, which is not my research. Sorry, I should have a citation on here. This is one of my favorite networks. So I don't know at all how they measure what a social interaction is in a dolphin pod, but I think I should be doing that for my research rather than young people. So anyway, you can see there's some dolphins over here that only have one interaction, whereas there's other super popular dolphins here. And then, yeah, there's a lot of research on secondary school students or high school students. So these are ethnicity segregated networks. And then there's also ego networks, which I will describe in a few slides, which is just from the perspective of one individual. So we have this ego in the middle, and then you ask them to name the important people in their lives or their friends, and they list all of these people around them, and you can tell where their friends are, where their family is, where other more external people are. Okay. Oh, oops. And then here's one more EgoNet that's much less connected and smaller. And I like this one because the person listed their dog, which my dog would most certainly end up in my social network. Okay. So all of that. So why should we study networks? So if you come from a social science discipline or any sort of like public health psychology sort of background, I think it's fair to say that it is known and intuitive that people influence each other through a network, that we live in a networked world where people and organizations are connected by different types of relationships, and that ideas spread through networks, behavior spread through networks, and that we're all connected in this social space. So, for example, you could take the statement of I eat vegetarian food, and you could look at this from either an individual perspective or a network perspective. So if you're taking, if you're taking an individual approach to understanding why someone has chosen to eat vegetarian food, you would probably look at things like their age, their SES, maybe how much education they have, what their gender is, and you would try to determine what things about this individual made it so that they eat vegetarian food. But if you are taking a network approach, you would also consider who's in their life. So maybe they have a vegetarian friend, and that is why they're a vegetarian themselves. So when you think of traditional survey methods, if you do anything with quantitative data, you're probably very used to data structures that look like this, where you have your study participants in one column, and then you have various attributes. So like we were just discussing from the individual perspective, their age, their education, their salary, things that you would use to predict your outcome. And then if you're coming from the social network perspective, you would also consider the relationships in their life. So you might consider their friendships. So there's a very simplified network over on the right here. And then we have the names of the 4 people in the network. This is called an adjacency matrix. And the zeros represent where people don't know each other, and the ones represent where they do, or where they're considered friends. So from a network perspective, you would use both of these things. So you would consider these individual characteristics, but you would say that they are only part of the story of why someone is a vegetarian. And it also probably has to do with the friendships in their life. So the concept basically is that people influence each other, the ideas and materials flow through networks, but that we're not saying that networks are the only thing that's important. There's also individual attributes that matter. So social network analysis is basically the combination of relational data and attribute data. So here is a famous definition of social networks. So social network analysis focuses on the relationships among social entities and on the patterns and implications of these relationships. So for example, you can have different types of relationships amongst entities. You could have friendship, you could have advice, you could have some form of like transaction that goes between entities. You can even have things like trade or wars. And then the nodes, well, so there's a bunch of different names. You have actors, nodes, or vertices. They all basically mean the same thing. So these could represent different things. So these could be people, like in a friendship network, or football teams, organizations, maybe they're banks looking at transactions, or countries and wars. Sorry, my clicker is being weird here. Okay, so then when we're talking about social networks, so we're talking about people in some way, it's important to remember that the nodes, the vertices in this network are actors. So they have some qualities to them. So they bring with them to this network. They bring with them their behaviors, their attitude, what their personality is. There's also usually motivations behind each of these things. So there are motivations for wanting to be connected to certain people to optimize their own social status. They also are subject to influence from other people in the network. So they're not the only part of the network to consider, not just their qualities and their motivations, but also the qualities and motivations of those that they're connected to. And then they also, when we're talking of networks, we can think of individual outcomes, so the health behavior of one student in particular, but we also could look at collective emergent outcomes like the level of cohesion within a school network or the prevalence of substance use, something like that. So there are different types of social networks split into 2 different categories, and people call them several different things. Sorry again for those of you who do networks, and this is all very introductory, but on the one hand, we have sociocentric or whole networks, and this is what we're talking about in the SOCITS project. So whole networks are used to investigate interactions within a bounded group. So in our case, we have schools. And so basically you identify a group and then you assess the social ties within that group. On the other hand, an EgoNet or a personal network is more similar to a traditional survey. So this type of network is used to investigate the effects of someone's social context on their individual attributes or behaviors. So you would ask a sample of participants, egos, about their contacts, about their social contacts, and then collect information about their attributes and the social connections within that personal network. So this is an example from long, long ago, and one of the first plots that I ever made, looking at friendship, excuse me, friendship and drinking in a US high school. And then this is an EgoNet or personal network where you have the perspective of the patient, patient in the middle, and then people that are important for their health surrounding them, with the color of these ties indicating whether that is a strong social relationship or a more weak tie. And overall, both types of these networks, so the EgoNets and the whole networks, allow us to evaluate social embeddedness and also to look at effects of different types of relationships. So if someone is a family member or someone that they have a challenging relationship with, a negative tie. And typically, dependent on the questions that you ask, you can combine subjective perceptions of the relationship, so like how they feel about that individual, along with what I'm saying are objective patterns of social structure. So if you're thinking of a friendship network, like who knows whom in a school would be more of an objective measure of the connections. And then when you are lucky enough to have longitudinal data, you get to look at network change and how network change is related to health change. So for network data collection in schools, like we did in the SOCITS project, typically you ask a handful of questions about different types of social relationships that they might have in the school. So you could ask about their friends, about any enemies, about people that they do activities with, like homework. And then once you have those different types of social relations, then you can ask questions about that relationship. So how close do you feel to that person? How important is that person to you? Do you go to that person for support? And the thing about collecting networks in schools is that you need to survey every single student that comprises your bounded region. So in our case, we did a year group of students. So we didn't do like all 6 years that go to that school, but we did 1 year group, and that was the network that we were interested in. And so this constitutes the complete network. And typically, when people are gathering social network data in schools, the networks are unsituated. So by unsituated, I mean we ask general questions about like, who are your friends in the school? Who's important to you? Things like that. So they're these like general pictures of social relationships versus situated would be a question like I'll show you in just a couple slides, saying like, in the classroom, who do you do group work with? Or during your free time, who do you talk to? Something like that. So you're taking a situation and then asking a network question specific to that situation. But typically we don't do that. Typically we just look at unsituated networks. And then I did want to point out, for those of you who do not do social network data collection, that normally when people do like this bounded social system, they only ask about the social ties within the school, within the the bounded area. But there are ways that you can capture out of school or out of boundary ties, but the way that you actually model them is slightly different. So in SOCITS, which Srebrenka is going to show you, we gathered unsituated networks and situated networks. So we did both because we wanted to see how these relationships were different and how they related to the student's well-being. So for our unsituated networks, we very typically asked for the names of friends that they spent the most time with. So we limited this to 10 friends because our survey was really long and we just needed to. So we asked them to nominate up to 10 people that they spend the most time with. And then they could also list people in the grade, so in their year group, that they didn't get along with because we wanted to capture negative ties. So we asked general friendships and then negative ties. And the students did this online using Qualtrics. Then to capture our situated networks, So there's two different, well, we talked through two different ways of doing this and spent quite a bit of time trying to determine which would be best for our students. So you can either ask the network first, so like we did, if you know who are your friends in the school, so you can gather the names, and then you can provide them with a list of situations and ask them who from that network shows up in those situations. So that's one way of doing it. Or you can identify your situations first and then go through each situation and ask them to list the people who would be present or important in that situation. And there are pros and cons to both of these. I don't know if I put this on the slide or not. Probably not. Okay, so the pro of the first one, of doing the network first and then the situation, is that then the names are already there. And so it's like less onerous for the student to go through and have names and then they can just tick per situation. But if you do situation first, obviously they have more to think about. They have to think about the situation and then the social ties that are present, but you might pick up on different people in that the students might be slightly lazy in the first method where they just like, you know, tick the friends because they're there. And so the second situation perhaps provides more like context into what is actually going on in the situation. But in SOCITS, we ended up going with option one. We felt that this was the best way to utilize the time in the survey and to not burden the students too much. I think we originally were planning on doing it both ways and comparing what sort of bias was introduced, but as far as I know, Jim, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but we've not done that. Okay, so we did option one, and we identified 4 situations, which if you were in Mark's talk last week, he talked about these different situations. So we asked them about having lunch in the canteen, having lunch not in the canteen, being in the library, and being in the quad, which in this school, the quad was like an outdoor space. So we identified through our various mixed methods approaches that these were the 4 situations that for our students mattered most in the school. And so we had these 4 situations, and we had their network, their unsituated network. And so they had like that little list there. And then they were presented with these 4 situations and they could choose from their friends who was there, or we had a little button where they also could add someone new and type in their name and then ask a handful of questions about those people. So before I hand to Srebrenka, just a quick thought on why to use situated networks, like what is the novelty of doing this. So the idea behind it is that students' emotions and their well-being are not necessarily traits, that they tend to be more of state type motions. So throughout the school day, they're likely to have these fluctuations in how they're feeling, and these might correspond to the social situations that they're in. So throughout the day, they're presented with a bunch of different people, a bunch of different social situations, some of which they have a say over and some of which they're just forced into, and their well-being and their stress and loneliness may fluctuate in response to the social situation. So by capturing situated networks, we're able to actually understand the social experience of each situation. So not just like, you know, who are your friends and then how lonely do you feel, but who are your friends, who is present in a specific situation, and how lonely do you feel? And so that's exactly what we're trying to do with the data, is to compare ratings of stress, loneliness, etc. in each situation in light of the people that are present in that situation. So for example, a student is likely to be less stressed if their friends are around in a situation than if they're in that situation without their friends. And then we also were interested in the presence of negative ties and whether negative ties maybe make a situation worse for a student. Anyway, so that was the background to collecting our situated networks. And I will hand over to Srebrenka as soon as I figure out how to stop my sharing. Yep, there we go. Are there any questions? No, okay.
Okay. Do you see my slides?
Yes. Yeah.
Yep.
Okay. So we will see some preliminary results, basically, and very basic analysis, because it's way beyond the scope of this webinar to go into more specific and more sophisticated analysis, where I'm going to show you what Emily was telling you about and how it looks in SOCITS projects. So just to give you an idea about the survey itself and its structure, maybe you heard about it already, but in case you haven't been on the previous webinars, it's good to know that this survey had several sections, and they included items that captured situated assessment of stress and loneliness in different situations. They had social network questions, both situated and unsituated, as Emily mentioned, and many unsituated measures as well, like the typical measures that you are aware of when we measure stress or loneliness on any other trait, in addition, of course, to the demographics. So I'm going to show you the results that we have for one of the schools, which we call School 3, and more than 300 students started the survey. Not all of them finished, and it had three school years, the school that we are going to look at. And it's important for you to note that there is a difference in the number of students who actually participated, because that has a huge effects on what you can do with the network data. So in school year 1, which is 11 and 12-year-old, we have 91%, much less in school S3, where you have 13 and 14 years old, and 71% in S5 and 6, which is 16 to 17 years old students. You can see that there was quite equal regarding the proportion of men, young men and young women. We had some trans non-binary people, but some didn't reply regarding their gender, but we will not look into gender-related analysis. This is just for you to have the idea about the context. So I want to show you the friendship networks. So those would be unsituated networks that Emily mentioned, and you have them here for 3 different school years, so 3 bounded networks. You can also see in the table below some very basic descriptives that you will usually see when you deal with networks. So for some of you, this is very basic and well known, but I want to take into consideration those that do not have experience with network. And I will just say that you can see that they differ in size, as you would expect, but density is a measure that shows you how many ties there are in comparison to how many there could be. And you can see it's pretty low, but this is something that is quite expected. Around 2% of all possible ties exist. Reciprocity is just what is the tendency to have reciprocal ties. If somebody nominated somebody else, that other person also nominated them as friends. And you can see that it's a pretty good, in the sense that it's 0.48, and at highest it would be 1. That would mean that all ties are reciprocal. And a number of groups, we are just use one of many community detection methods to give us idea how modular the network is. And you can see that there is a difference in the among older school year. You can see more groups. So that's friendship network. But when we actually deal with the data, we want to have some kind of a measure from those networks for each individual, and usually you use measures that say something about how individual is connected. The most simple one, most intuitive one, is number of ties that person has to others. Those ties could be outgoing, meaning number of people they have nominated as friends, or ingoing, number of people who nominated that person as their friend. So it's a very simple measure, and you can see here the distributions. The reason I'm showing them to you is because they're usually very skewed. So you can see that they could nominate up to 10 friends, and most of them nominated about 1. But then you have like a range, and there are some who nominated 10 friends. And the in degree obviously varies more than 10, because you could be nominated by more people than 10. You can be nominated by everyone, and in theory. And you can see here something that's you will see a lot in network research, and that some individuals do have a high number of in degree or nominations, but they are very popular. So that's something that you will always expect in the network research. But there are other types of ties as well, as Emily mentioned, and especially when you think about the mental health and many individual outcomes, you want to consider the ties that are not pleasant. And for that, we had a question: which people in your school year group do you not get along with? That could be for different reasons, and then they could nominate up to 3. So smaller number of nominations, and you can see the networks here. They look quite different, and if you saw many networks, you will immediately notice that. And based on these measures that are written in the table, that will help you to actually identify where the difference is. First, there is a lower reciprocity. So if I nominated you as somebody that I don't get along with, there was not a lot that we saw that that person also nominated myself as somebody that they don't get along with, which is very interesting when you think about it. And then transitivity almost does not exist. So there is not a tendency. So you don't see a triangles in the network. There is not a tendency like we saw in the friendship networks. If I have 2 friends, that they're also friends themselves. So that's another very important difference. And there are many groups. It seems that these negative ties are very local thing, and they do not spread in one connected network. So obviously that shows you a different structure from friendship networks. But when we look at its distribution, you can again see, given that they could only nominate 3, that out degree varies from 1 to 3, and nothing especially interesting there. But again, as with positive ties, we can see that there are some individuals who are unpopular in the sense that they have been nominated by quite a few number of people as a person they don't get along with. And that's sort of interesting because it indicates that maybe there are certain individuals that are more conflict prone. And it also gives you an idea where to look at in the network when you are interested in this type of negative ties or any sort of situations that could be upsetting. So if we look at now at measures that are not situated, and we look at the non-situated network, so very typical type of network research, and we take that into account, you can usually see plots like this, where you can see that on these plots, the size of the node corresponds to the higher value of loneliness. And if the node is gray, we didn't have data for the loneliness of that person that didn't participate in the study, but was nominated as a friend by somebody else. So you can then try to figure out, okay, like, is there some relation here between like position in the network that person has and their loneliness score? Maybe there is some relation. And this type of approach to looking at the relationship between network and some outcome is called positional. Is there like some relation between where I am in the network and my outcome? But however, you can measure that position in many different ways, and we will use the most simple ones, the ones that I mentioned you. It's simply the number of nominations that you gave and the number of nominations that you received as a friend to capture the network position. So you can see now below on the left, you have a scatter plot which shows you for all 3 networks together, what is the relation between in degree and loneliness. There seems to be a negative one. So that means that you're less likely to be nominated as a friend the more lonely you are, which makes sense. Bear in mind that this is normalized in degree values so that we can actually compare those networks of different sizes and put them together. For out degree, you can see that there is basically no relationship with loneliness. Now, with anxiety, we did exactly the same. You can see look at the networks, try to figure out what is the relationship, but figures can be misleading. So again, for all of those non-missing values and for all 3 schools together, you can see just like a very descriptive way to see the relationship, and you can see there is a negative relationship with in degree and anxiety. The more anxious students were, they were less likely to be nominated as somebody's friend, and also they are less likely to nominate others as more other people as friends. And for depression, again, we can look and see that there is not a strong correlation as well, and it's negative for depression, smaller in degree, or you are less likely to be nominated as a friend, and slightly higher out degree. But, that's one way to look at this story. But we know there's far more to networks than just how many friends you have on which position you hold. So you can, look at this in a different ways. This is, by the way, for the stress, the same measure. But you can see that there is a quite bigger correlation in comparison with the previous one you showed. The more stressed students were, they were more inclined to nominate more people as their friends, which is an interesting relationship. But as I said, we are just talking about the network position, but there is so much more to networks, and we can look at it in other ways as well. That would be positional approach. More relational approach would be if you think about whether those who I'm connected with and their stress may be more similar to mine due to process of social influence or selection. That is not something that you will capture if you just look at in degree and out degree and its relation with certain outcome. But this type of testing of this type of hypothesis requires different type of models, and those models need to take into account the interdependence of network data, which, as I said, is beyond the scope of this webinar. But it's very important for you to note that even when you're looking at a positional approach and like relation of in degree and out degree and certain outcome, that you need to if you want to correctly answer your research question, use the methods that control for interdependence and for social processes that happen in the network. One of them, more basic one actually, is the multiple regression quadratic assignment procedure, where you can predict the likelihood of a tie in a network and include and investigate multiple mechanisms, including node attributes at the same time. And these methods preserves the network structure, which is good, but it doesn't actually model it explicitly. So if you wanted to do that, you would go even more into more advanced methods and use ergms, exponential random graph models, or other methods that exist for this type of data. But that's just to give you an example what happens when we control for transitivity, the tendency of friends to be friends themselves. And when we took into account the stress and its relationship with in degree and out degree, and also the similarity of each pair of individuals in the network and their stress, at the same time, then we can see something that not necessarily we would capture if we just look descriptively, as I showed you before. And you can see here for this network that transitivity was an important process that could explain the probability of having a tie is bigger if you share a friend, and there is no similarity in stress among pairs of connected individuals. But there is some tendency of those who have higher stress to actually have higher in degree, although that estimate is really small, and have lower out degree. So, just an example, and we got a similar results for anxiety as well. We are just starting to model this just to have this in mind. So once we cover that, we can go to negative ties, right? Because we looked at the positive ties, friendship ties, and we know that they are important, but also negative ties could be important. And I just want to show you really quickly scatter plots for in degree and out degree in this network of negative ties and outcomes of stress, anxiety, loneliness, and depression. And you can see that correlations here are notably higher for most of the outcomes. And you can see that there is a relationship to more depressed, anxious, or stressed you are, the less you have, the smaller is your in degree in the network. And now regarding the out degree, you can see the relationship here. And then you can see the biggest correlation that we saw so far is between out degree and stress. The more stressed I am, more likely I am to nominate many others, which kind of makes sense when you think about it. Like when you're stressed, you sometimes really, if you're not too stressed, you have that has a tendency to make you more likely to reach out to others because you need support or something like that. And similar tendency you can see for loneliness, depression, and anxiety. But as I said before, if you really want to look at this correctly and answer this type of research questions correctly, you need models that can actually capture that. So maybe some of you have attended previous webinars, then you will be maybe familiar with this plot. But as you know, we estimated stress in many situations, many different situations. And based on that, what you can do a latent profile analysis, which will allow you to find out different groups of students based on the similarity of their results and classify them. And that's how we identified 9 different groups given their profile in stress, which situations they found stressful. So for example, you can see the pink one here, which tells you about the group who has had overall really high stress in most of situations, except for quads and subjects that they liked. But you can also see the red one, which is the group which had a lower stress, but higher for subjects they didn't like and exams, and the blue one, for example, as well, which had really high for exams and parents and teachers. So stressing situations with those individuals and those with exams. So then we can plot those different, based on which group they belong, on the network, unsituated network, and see whether they have tendency to be together. So adolescents, whether they have tendency to be friends with others who have similar profile of stress in different situations. So you can see here that we can kind of observe that, because you see that the red ones are kind of together. So the ones, very high number of students who had I think a bit bigger stress for some situations, but mostly very average. Then for pink ones as well, who are very stressed in general, you can see that there is some tendency that they are together and so on. This is for school year 1. For school year 3, again, you can notice some of the tendencies. So that, colors of the same colors tend to be, especially the pink ones and the red ones and the blue ones, which I described it to you, tend to be together, suggesting that friends have a tendency to have to find similar situations stressful. And this is for school year 6. So, another way in which you can use unsituated network with situated information. However, what about situated networks? So far, for instance, from the one ego network, as Emily explained you before, what is ego network about when you look in one individual and their ties. So this is the real data, and the individual and that we are looking at is 85. That's its code, and we can see their ego net of their friendship ties. And you can also see their ego net of their negative ties. So you can see that they have 3 ingoing and 2 outgoing negative ties. So, this is unsituated ego net of this person. But if you go into situated network, who is with around that person when they are in canteen, then you can see that some other people emerge. We can see now 80 is there, who has a negative relationship with 85 and with somebody else. And you can see that also in other situations, how this network of this person looks like. So this was just an example of an ego network, but another I will show you example on all of the networks. So this is a network in canteen, which you get when you ask a question like, who from your year is usually around when you are eating lunch in the school canteen? And Emily described you the process. We used the option 1, as she said. That's why you see ties of different type, because we just ask who is around. We don't know what is the relationship with them. That's what we actually deduce from the information that we have about what they told us about their friends and about those that they don't get along to. So then we know what kind of relationship they have with them. But some people that they will name, they didn't name as a friend or as an enemy. So we know that they're just there, they're present, but there is no tie. So all of that may be important and could be important when you're looking at the stress that this particular situation, like eating lunch in canteen, creates. And what you see for this network and their basic properties is that they are quite similar to the friendship networks, right? Because you can see that there is a density that exists at similar level and reciprocity that is also there in the similar level. You can see triangles in the networks, so that means that there is transitivity, which you would expect a lot. So, and there are many groups, far more than when we looked at the friendship networks, which may have something to do with the fact that this is very situational. But also we looked at the library. You can see that those networks now look a bit different. That for school year 3 and school year 6, you can see that they are like smaller groups, not connected. Quite different situation for school year 1. Now we can make hypotheses why is that so, but we will not go into that right now. We will instead show you for the quad network. So who from your year is usually around when you are in the quad. And then you can see, again, interesting how there are many small groups. As you would expect in library, you don't see the whole library necessary. So that would explain, but there are usually a bit smaller groups there. But yeah, also there is similar, reciprocity and transitivity. You can see all of that in these networks. So now, when you saw these examples, we can say a bit more about these networks at some closer look. As Emily mentioned, this option, when you first ask them to show them those people that they nominated before as their friends or enemies, and then ask them who of them was around, can have as a result that they don't report too many of others. And that's why you don't have those that neither have positive or negative ties. And you can see that there is very small percentage of such in canteen, library, and quad, just 2 to 6%. Most of them are in the quad, which also tells you something possibly about social cognition and who are we aware of when we are in certain situations. Not necessarily that is the case, but that the reality is that there are no other people around. What is interesting here, and we don't have to go into that, is that you can see that the percentage of negative ties is actually highest in the library. I found that interesting, but who knows what is the reason for that. And from just going back to the unsituated network, when you look at the overlap of these networks with friendship networks, you can use a measure which is called Jacquard index, which shows you the overlap of the present ties. And you can see that there is quite a big overlap. The maximum would be 1 with canteen network, smaller with library, and yet smaller with quad network, showing you that those are more and more different from friendship networks that we looked at first and that are unsituated. So we do get a different information from this type of networks. They are different. And this is the final slide, which actually shows you the results, and where you can see that we join the situated measures of stress and the situated network in the quad. And again, bigger node means higher value. Now you can go in and see, okay, like whether maybe there is not relation between the unsituated stress and unsituated network position, or there is no social influence. However, the stress that individuals feel in certain situations like quad there can be social influence, even in that case, regarding those individuals who are present in that situation. So it gives you some information that you don't get from the usual way that we collect the data. And here you can see the same plot for the same situation, how lonely individuals were in the network of in the quad. So, again, a social influence that you would not necessarily capture in the unsituated measures of network and certain outcomes, you may capture, and it may actually exist in certain situations with this type of methodology. So to summarize, you have seen some of the example of unsituated networks and unsituated assessment, and that you saw that networks of negative ties are very different from the friendship networks in their structure, and they are important for the outcomes, different outcomes. There are different approaches to looking at this, different ways to look to think about why networks matter, because of the position of the network, because of the influence of those that we are connected with. But it's important to use the right methods that will control for everything that you want to control for, in order to come to an appropriate conclusion about whether network is important for whatever you're looking at. And for situated measures, you saw that actually our friends, for those in this school, had a tendency to have similar profile regarding the stress they felt in different situations. And situated networks, as you can see and you saw, is that it has many different type of ties, which presents a bit of challenge when it comes to modeling, not only friendship ties. And they differ for different situations. We saw that clearly, even when with similarity with friendship network, the county network was still quite different. And finally, there are many options and avenues that this approach opens up, as I said, because you can investigate social influence that happens in a certain network for a certain situation that may not exist for unsituated network and for unsituated outcome. So that would be all from me, and I hope that we have some time for some questions, and I will stop sharing.